The notification sound on my phone had become my enemy. Each ping meant another comment, another share, another stranger dissecting the worst moments of my life for entertainment. I sat in my bedroom at 73 years old, watching my daughter Rebecca's latest video climb toward 50,000 views. The thumbnail showed me mid-confusion, mouth agape, standing in my own kitchen like I'd never seen it before. The title read, Mom's Morning Meltdown, Living with Early Dementia Day 47. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 47. She'd been documenting my decline for 47 days, turning my most vulnerable moments into content for her lifestyle channel. In the comments, strangers debated whether I was faking it, offered unsolicited medical advice, and shared their own family horror stories. Some called Rebecca brave for sharing our journey. Others called her exploitative. None of them knew that I was still here, still me, still reading every single word they wrote about the woman I used to be. But what they also didn't know was what I'd found buried in Rebecca's desk drawer 3 weeks ago. Financial documents that painted a very different picture of my loving, devoted daughter. Bank statements showing exactly where the ad revenue from my humiliation was going. And tonight, I was going to give her audience something truly shocking to watch. My name is Faye Morrison, and until 18 months ago, I was someone you would have described as sharp as a tack. I ran Morrison Associates, a small but successful accounting firm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for 37 years. I balanced books, managed payroll for dozens of local businesses, and never missed a decimal point. My mind was my greatest asset, a steel trap that could recall client numbers from decades past and spot discrepancies in financial statements from across the room. I lived in the same modest ranch house on Maple Street that my late husband Robert and I had bought in 1978. The mortgage was paid off in 1995, the garden was meticulously maintained, and every bill was filed in alphabetical order in my home office. My 2 children, Rebecca and David, had grown up in that house, played in that yard, and learned the value of hard work and financial responsibility at my kitchen table. Rebecca was 38 now, a former marketing coordinator turned stay-at-home mom who discovered social media during the pandemic. What started as innocent posts about her 3 children had evolved into a lifestyle brand called Authentic Motherhood with Becca. She had 47,000 followers who hung on her every word about organic baby food, postpartum depression, and the challenges of modern parenting. Her content was polished, relatable, and profitable. Very profitable. David lived in Portland with his partner Marcus, working as a software engineer for a startup that designed apps for elderly care. The irony wasn't lost on me. He visited twice a year, called every Sunday, and sent thoughtful gifts that showed he actually listened when I spoke. Unlike Rebecca, who lived just 20 minutes away but seemed to hear only what she wanted to hear. For 71 years, I'd been the person everyone turned to when they needed something figured out. Tax problems, budget crises, financial planning. I was the Morrison who made sense of chaos. When Rebecca's husband lost his job in 2019, I co-signed their car loan. When David needed help with his student loans, I restructured his payments. When my neighbor Mrs. Chen needed someone to manage her late husband's estate, I spent 3 months sorting through 40 years of paperwork for free. Then came the morning I woke up and couldn't remember how to make coffee. It wasn't the forgetting that terrified me initially. It was the certainty that this was the beginning of something I couldn't fix, couldn't organize, couldn't solve with a spreadsheet and determination. I'd watched my own mother slip away piece by piece in her final years, and I'd sworn I'd handle things differently when my time came. I'd be prepared. I'd have a plan. But you can't plan for the exact moment your brain betrays you. You can't schedule when you'll stand in your own living room and not recognize the furniture you picked out piece by piece over decades. You can't budget for the cost of losing yourself while still being completely aware that it's happening. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. Dr. Patricia Williams, a neurologist who looked younger than my reading glasses, delivered the news with the kind of gentle professionalism that only comes from practice. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Moderate progression expected. 2 to 5 years before significant cognitive decline. Time to get my affairs in order. I sat in that sterile office holding a folder full of pamphlets about support groups and memory care facilities, and felt the ground shift beneath everything I'd built. For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't see a clear path forward. I couldn't make a plan that would guarantee a specific outcome. I could only trust that the people who loved me would help me navigate what was coming. That trust, it turned out, was misplaced. I told Rebecca first. She was sitting at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped her with homework and taught her to balance a checkbook. Her youngest, Emma, was napping in her car seat, and the afternoon light filtered through the curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years earlier. Everything felt normal until I spoke the words that would change everything. I need to tell you something important, sweetheart. I've been having some memory issues, and I saw a specialist. It's Alzheimer's, Rebecca. Early stage, but it's confirmed. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. No tears, no shock, no immediate questions about treatment or prognosis. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Oh my God, Mom. This explains so much. I've been worried about you for months." Months. She'd been worried for months and hadn't said a word to me. As I tried to process this, she continued talking. But she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to herself, working through something in her mind that felt separate from my diagnosis. "The content opportunities here are incredible," she said, then immediately caught herself. "I mean, the awareness we could raise. Do you know how many families are dealing with this? How isolated they feel? We could really help people, Mom." Content opportunities. The phrase sat between us like a foreign object. I understood the words individually but couldn't make sense of them together in this context. I was telling my daughter that I was losing my mind, and she was seeing an opportunity. That's when she explained her idea. She wanted to document our journey together. Nothing exploitative, she assured me, just honest glimpses into what families face when dealing with dementia. She already had a platform, an engaged audience, who trusted her authenticity. She could use her reach to destigmatize Alzheimer's, to show that families could face this diagnosis with grace and humor and love. Think about it, Mom. Mrs. Patterson from down the street, her husband has dementia, right? And she's struggling alone because no one talks about it. We could help her feel less alone. We could help thousands of families feel less alone. She was persuasive, my Rebecca. She always had been. Even as a child, she could convince her teachers to extend deadlines, her friends to loan her money, her brother to take the blame for broken dishes. She presented her idea as altruism, as education, as a way to transform our private struggle into public service. "I'd never show anything you weren't comfortable with," she promised. "And honestly, Mom, it might help with the medical expenses. The ad revenue could offset some of the costs you're going to face." Medical expenses. I owned my home outright, had excellent insurance and more savings than Rebecca realized. But I didn't correct her assumption. I was still processing the idea that my daughter wanted to turn my illness into content for strangers to consume. "I need to think about it," I told her. "Of course," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Just remember, this could be really meaningful for both of us, and for so many other families." That night, I called David in Portland. His reaction was everything Rebecca's wasn't. Silence first, then questions about doctors and treatment options, then quiet tears that I could hear through the phone. He asked what I needed, how he could help, whether I wanted him to fly out immediately. He didn't mention content or audiences or opportunities. He just asked how I was feeling. When I told him about Rebecca's proposal, the silence stretched longer. "Mom," he finally said, "you don't have to perform your illness for anyone, not even for Rebecca." Perform. The word stayed with me for days. Was that what she was asking me to do? Perform my decline for an audience of strangers who would watch, comment, and move on to the next video in their feed? 2 weeks later, Rebecca brought it up again. This time, she had a contract printed on professional letterhead. She'd consulted with a lawyer about privacy releases and profit sharing. She'd researched the most ethical ways to monetize personal content. She'd created a content calendar that would take us through the next 6 months. The thoroughness of her preparation should have impressed me. Instead, it chilled me to the bone. While I was still adjusting to the reality of my diagnosis, still grieving the future I'd lost, she was building a business plan around my deterioration. "I know this feels overwhelming," she said, spreading papers across my dining room table. "But I really think this could be beautiful, Mom. A love story between a mother and daughter facing the hardest thing imaginable together. A love story." I looked at the contract, at the detailed breakdown of revenue splits and content ownership, and wondered if this was what love looked like in Rebecca's world. Monetized, optimized, and shared with thousands of strangers for their entertainment and her profit. But I was scared. I was 71 years old, facing a future that terrified me, and my daughter was offering to hold my hand through it. Even if that hand was also holding a camera, it was still my daughter's hand. Even if she was planning to share our journey with her audience, we'd still be taking that journey together. So I signed the contract. I gave her permission to film our sessions with my doctors, our conversations about my fears, my moments of confusion and clarity. I told myself that if it helped even one family feel less alone, it would be worth the discomfort of living my private struggle in public. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't just signing away my privacy. I was signing away my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to be anything more than a cautionary tale for Rebecca's followers. The first video went live on a Thursday morning in late April. I'd almost forgotten about it when Rebecca called, breathless with excitement. "Mom, you have to see this." The response is incredible. We're already at 12,000 views, and it's only been 4 hours. 12,000 strangers had watched me receive my diagnosis. 12,000 people had seen me cry in Dr. Williams' office, had heard me ask questions about my future that I'd assumed would stay between my daughter and me. The video was titled, "The Day Everything Changed, Mom's Alzheimer's Diagnosis." I watched it that evening on my laptop, and I barely recognized myself. Rebecca had edited our conversation to highlight my most emotional moments, cutting away my longer explanations and keeping the clips where I looked lost or confused. She'd added soft piano music and text overlays that provided context I hadn't approved. "Mom has always been the strong one in our family," read one caption over a shot of me staring out the doctor's office window. Watching her vulnerability is heartbreaking. The comments were a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. People praising Rebecca for her bravery in sharing something so personal. Others offering advice about supplements and alternative treatments. A few questioning whether this was appropriate content to share publicly. But they were all talking about me like I wasn't there, like I was already gone. That night, I called Rebecca. "I'm not comfortable with how you edited that video," I told her. "You made me look more confused than I actually was." "Mom, I just wanted to show the emotional reality of what we're dealing with. People need to see that it's okay to be scared." But I wasn't just scared. I asked intelligent questions. I understood everything Dr. Williams told me. "You edited all of that out." "I had to keep it under 10 minutes for the algorithm," she explained. "But don't worry, the next video will show more of your strength." The algorithm. My daughter was editing my life to satisfy the demands of an algorithm. The next video was worse. Rebecca had filmed me in my kitchen on a morning when I'd been particularly foggy. I'd stood in front of my coffee maker for several minutes, unable to remember the steps I'd performed thousands of times before. It was a private moment of frustration, one I'd thought she was documenting for our family's records, not for public consumption. Instead, it became Mom's morning struggle, when simple tasks become mountains. The video showed me standing helplessly in my own kitchen, Rebecca's voice narrating my confusion for her audience. She explained that this was what Alzheimer's looked like in real families, how quickly someone could go from capable to confused. The comments were different this time. People debated whether I was really that impaired or if I was exaggerating for the camera. Others shared their own stories of parents who'd forgotten how to perform basic tasks. A few suggested that Rebecca was being too intrusive, filming me at my most vulnerable. But the video had over 30,000 views in the first week. Rebecca called to tell me we'd earned our first significant ad revenue check. "See, Mom? This is really working. We're helping people, and we're creating a financial cushion for your care." A financial cushion I didn't need. for care I could afford, from content that made me look like a helpless child in my own home. That's when I realized what was happening. My daughter wasn't documenting our journey through my illness. She was curating my decline for maximum engagement. Every confused moment, every emotional breakdown, every instance of forgetting something important was potential content for her channel. And I was the product she was selling. The videos kept coming, each one more invasive than the last. Rebecca filmed me during doctor's appointments, capturing moments when I couldn't remember the word I was looking for, or when I asked the same question twice. She recorded our conversations about my fears for the future, editing them to emphasize my confusion and her patience. Mom's bad day, when Alzheimer's takes control, showed me crying in my living room after I'd forgotten my neighbor's name. Teaching Mom to use her pill organizer featured Rebecca explaining my medication schedule like I was a child, complete with graphics highlighting my mistakes. Each video painted the same picture. Faye Morrison, once sharp and capable, now dependent on her daughter's guidance and patience. The comments section became a place where strangers discussed my cognitive abilities, debated my prognosis, and praised Rebecca for her sacrifice in caring for me. But I wasn't that woman yet. Yes, I had bad days, moments of confusion and frustration. Yes, I sometimes forgot names or struggled with tasks that used to be automatic. But I was still reading complex financial documents, still managing my own medications, still driving and shopping and living independently. Rebecca's videos showed only my worst moments, creating a narrative that was convenient for her content, but devastating for my sense of self. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in July. I'd been having a particularly good week, my mind sharp and clear, my memory functioning better than it had in months. Rebecca arrived for our usual filming session, camera already rolling as she walked through my front door. "Good morning, Mom," she said brightly. "How are we feeling today?" We. As if my illness was something we shared equally. "I'm feeling quite well, actually," I told her. "I balanced my checkbook yesterday, reorganized my file cabinet, and I'm reading a fascinating book about the history of accounting." Her face fell slightly. Good days didn't make for compelling content. "That's wonderful," she said, but I could see her mind working. "Maybe we could talk about how you're feeling about the progression of your symptoms. Our audience loves when you share your emotions." Our audience. When did my private struggle become our shared commodity? "Rebecca, I'd like to talk to you about something," I said, sitting down at my kitchen table. "I've been thinking about these videos, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with how I'm being portrayed." She set the camera down but didn't turn it off. The red recording light continued to blink. "What do you mean?" "You only show my confused moments, my bad days. People watching these videos think I'm much more impaired than I actually am." "Mom, I'm showing the reality of this disease, the good days and the bad days." "No, you're not. You're showing only the bad days because they get more views." The conversation that followed became another video. Mom's denial phase when Alzheimer's patients reject help. Rebecca edited our discussion to make it appear that I was becoming paranoid and unreasonable, cutting away my valid concerns and keeping only the moments when I seemed agitated. In the comments, people expressed sympathy for Rebecca, praising her patience with a mother who was losing touch with reality. Others shared their own experiences with elderly parents who couldn't accept their limitations. I watched that video with a growing sense of horror. My daughter had turned my advocacy for myself into evidence of my cognitive decline. She'd made my reasonable concerns about privacy and dignity look like symptoms of my disease. That's when I realized the true scope of what she'd done. She'd trapped me in a narrative where any objection to her documentation could be dismissed as part of my illness. If I complained about the videos, I was being paranoid. If I questioned her editing choices, I was confused. If I asked her to stop filming, I was rejecting the help I needed. She'd made me into a character in her story, and that character was supposed to be grateful for the daughter who was brave enough to share their journey with the world. But late at night, when Rebecca wasn't filming, when the comments weren't pouring in, when the ad revenue checks weren't being deposited, I was still me. I was still Faye Morrison, certified public accountant, homeowner, mother of 2, and a woman who'd spent 7 decades making her own decisions. And I was angry. The anger wasn't the confused rage that Rebecca's audience expected from Alzheimer's patients. It was the clear, cold fury of a woman who'd realized she'd been betrayed by the person she trusted most. My daughter had taken my vulnerability and transformed it into her success story. She'd built her brand on my decline and called it love. But Rebecca had made one crucial mistake in her months of turning my life into content. She'd forgotten that I was still an accountant, still someone who understood numbers and patterns and where money came from. And as I sat in my home office that evening, surrounded by the financial skills that 40 years of practice had made automatic, I began to trace exactly where the profits from my public humiliation were going. What I found in those bank statements, in those investment accounts, in those business expenses that Rebecca thought I'd never understand, would give me all the ammunition I needed to teach my daughter a lesson about the true cost of exploiting someone you claim to love. The algorithm, as Rebecca was so fond of mentioning, was about to learn what happened when you built a brand on someone else's pain. And my audience was about to get much larger than hers. The investigation began the way all my best accounting work had over the years, with a single discrepancy that caught my attention. I was reviewing my own bank statements one afternoon, a habit I'd maintained religiously since my diagnosis, when I noticed a charge I didn't recognize. A monthly payment of $300 to something called Morrison Media LLC. Morrison Media LLC. My daughter had incorporated a business using our family name without telling me. The discovery sent a familiar thrill through my system, the same feeling I used to get when I found an error in someone's books that they'd missed for months. Numbers don't lie, Robert used to say when I'd come home excited about unraveling some client's financial mystery. Numbers tell the truth even when people won't. I spent the next 3 days doing what I did best, following the money trail. It started with a simple internet search for Morrison Media LLC, which led me to a Wyoming business registration listing Rebecca as the sole owner and operator. The business description was deliberately vague: digital content creation and social media consulting services. But it was the incorporation date that made my hands shake. March 15th. 2 days before my diagnosis. She'd started the business before she even knew I had Alzheimer's. I called my bank, using the voice I'd perfected over decades of demanding answers from uncooperative financial institutions. The customer service representative, probably assuming I was just another confused elderly woman, initially tried to brush off my questions about the recurring charge. "Ma'am, if you don't remember authorizing this payment, we can help you dispute it." "I didn't say I don't remember," I said firmly. "I said I don't recognize it. There's a difference. I need to know when this automatic payment was set up and what authorization you have on file." The tone shift was immediate. "Let me pull up those records for you, Mrs. Morrison." The payment had been set up on April 2nd, 2 weeks after Rebecca's first video went live. The authorization signature on file matched my handwriting, but I had no memory of signing anything related to Morrison Media LLC. According to the bank's records, I was listed as providing, quote, ongoing consulting services to the company. Consulting services. My daughter was paying me $300 a month for the privilege of exploiting my illness, and she'd disguised it as a business expense. That evening, I sat in my home office with a yellow legal pad, mapping out what I'd discovered. Rebecca had created a business entity specifically for monetizing my Alzheimer's content. She was paying me a token amount that could be written off as a consulting fee, making her operation appear legitimate and ethical. Meanwhile, according to the information I was gathering, her monthly revenue from the channel was approaching $5,000. She was paying me 6% of what she earned from my humiliation. The next morning, I drove to the library. My home computer was adequate for basic internet searches, but I needed access to better research tools, and I wanted to work somewhere Rebecca couldn't walk in and interrupt me. The librarian, a woman named Janet who'd helped me research various topics over the years, greeted me with her usual smile. "Working on something interesting today, Mrs. Morrison." "A fraud case," I told her, which was true enough. "I need to look into some business records and social media analytics." Janet helped me access several databases that I couldn't reach from home: business filings, tax records, social media monitoring tools that tracked channel performance and revenue estimates. I spent 4 hours that day learning more about my daughter's online empire than she probably realized I could understand. The picture that emerged was staggering. Rebecca's channel, which had been modestly successful before my diagnosis, had exploded in popularity since she started featuring my story. Her subscriber count had tripled. Her average views per video had increased by 400%. According to the analytics tools, she was earning approximately $60,000 annually from advertising revenue alone. But that wasn't all. She'd also launched a Patreon account where subscribers could pay for behind-the-scenes content, featuring more intimate moments of my struggle. For $15 a month, supporters could access video calls where Rebecca discussed my journey in more detail. For $50 a month, they received personalized updates about my condition and exclusive footage that didn't make it into the main videos. My private medical information, my personal struggles, my worst moments, packaged and sold to strangers at multiple price points. I printed everything I could, paying for copies with exact change and organizing the documents in a manila folder that I labeled Rebecca Morrison Business Analysis. The professional distance of treating this like any other accounting investigation helped me manage the rage that threatened to overwhelm me whenever I thought too directly about what I was uncovering. That night, I called David. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said. "Has Rebecca talked to you about her videos?" There was a pause. "Mom, I've been meaning to bring this up. I'm really uncomfortable with what she's doing." "Have you watched them?" "A few. I couldn't stand it. She's making you look helpless, Mom. And the comments people are leaving, some of them are just cruel." David had seen what I was seeing, the distortion, the exploitation disguised as caregiving. But he'd been afraid to say anything, worried that criticizing Rebecca might make my situation worse, or cause family conflict that I didn't need while dealing with my diagnosis. "There's more," I told him. "She's making significant money from these videos. She created a business, David. She incorporated specifically to monetize my illness." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "How much money?" he finally asked. I gave him the numbers I'd calculated. The revenue estimates, the subscription fees, the consulting payment she was making to me that represented a tiny fraction of her earnings. "Jesus, Mom, this is exploitation. This is elder abuse." Elder abuse. The term hit me like cold water. In all my analysis of the financial aspects, I hadn't framed it in legal terms. But that's exactly what this was. My daughter was financially exploiting my cognitive vulnerability for her personal gain. "I want to gather more information before I do anything," I told him. "But David, I need you to promise me something. Don't let on that you know about this. Not yet." "What are you planning?" "I'm going to give her audience something real to watch." Over the next week, I expanded my investigation. I created fake social media accounts to access Rebecca's private groups and Patreon content. I documented every video, every post, every comment she made about my condition. I tracked the correlation between my bad days and her posting schedule, noting how she seemed to time her content releases to maximize engagement. The pattern was damning. Rebecca would visit me more frequently when I was having difficult periods, always arriving with her camera ready. She'd encourage me to talk about my fears, to demonstrate tasks I was struggling with, to share intimate details about how the disease was affecting me. Then she'd disappear for days while she edited the footage, returning only when she needed more content. But it was the Patreon content that truly revealed the depth of her betrayal. In the subscriber-only videos, Rebecca spoke about me with a clinical detachment that was chilling. She discussed my good days as periods when content creation was challenging because I seemed too normal. She strategized about ways to capture more dramatic footage, wondering aloud whether certain medications might be making me appear more lucid than her audience expected. In one video that made my hands shake with fury, she actually complained about having to visit me when I was feeling well, because it meant she couldn't film anything usable for her channel. "It's weird," she told her paying subscribers, "because obviously I want Mom to have good days, but they don't really serve the narrative we're building. People tune in to see the struggle, to understand what families like ours go through. When she's just sitting there reading a book and remembering everything perfectly, it's not exactly compelling content." She wanted me to be sicker for her camera. She was disappointed when I had good days because they interfered with her content calendar. I saved that video to my computer, along with dozens of others that revealed Rebecca's true motivations. She wasn't documenting our journey through Alzheimer's to help other families. She was manufacturing a specific narrative about my decline to build her personal brand and generate income. The final piece of evidence I needed came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor whose husband truly did have advanced dementia, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole and a concerned expression. "Faye, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been watching Rebecca's videos because she mentioned us in one of them. I invited her in, my heart sinking." Rebecca had mentioned the Pattersons? She said we were struggling alone because no one talks about dementia, and that her videos were helping families like ours feel less isolated. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily at my kitchen table. "But Faye, honey, you and I both know that's not true. You've been helping us for months, long before she started making those videos. You've been bringing us groceries, helping me understand his medications, even balancing our checkbook when I got overwhelmed." She was right. I'd been quietly supporting the Pattersons since Mr. Patterson's diagnosis the previous year, using my accounting skills to help them navigate insurance claims and organize their finances. Rebecca knew about this because I'd mentioned it to her several times, suggesting that real support for dementia families looked like practical help, not public documentation. "The thing is," Mrs. Patterson continued, "in her video she made it sound like you were too impaired to help anyone, like you could barely take care of yourself. But that's not the woman who spent 3 hours last week teaching me how to use online banking so I could manage Tom's medical bills." Rebecca had lied to her audience about my capabilities to support her narrative about my decline. She'd erased my continued competence and independence because they didn't fit the story she was selling. That night, I sat in my office and wrote down everything I discovered, organizing it the way I would for any client presentation. The evidence was overwhelming. Rebecca had systematically exploited my diagnosis for financial gain, misrepresented my condition to her audience, and violated my privacy in ways that went far beyond what I'd consented to. But more than that, she'd stolen my agency. She'd turned me into a character in her story, a cautionary tale who existed solely to generate sympathy and engagement for her brand. She'd made me invisible as a person while making my illness hypervisible as content. I thought about all the years I'd spent helping people understand their finances, explaining complex situations in terms they could grasp, showing them how numbers told stories about their lives. Now I was going to use those same skills to tell a story about Rebecca, using her own numbers to reveal exactly who she'd become. The next morning, Rebecca arrived for another filming session. She was particularly cheerful, probably because her latest video had performed well. She set up her camera in my living room and sat down across from me with the bright smile she'd perfected for her audience. "Good morning, Mom. I thought today we could talk about how you're managing your medications. My followers are really interested in practical tips for families dealing with similar situations." I looked at her, this daughter I'd raised to value honesty and integrity, who was now building her career on my vulnerability. She had no idea that I'd spent the past month unraveling every aspect of her business, that I understood exactly how much money she was making from my pain. "That sounds fine, sweetheart," I said, settling back in my chair. "But first, I have something I'd like to share with your followers. Something I think they'd find very educational." Rebecca's smile brightened. She loved it when I seemed engaged with her content creation. "Of course, Mom. What did you want to talk about?" I smiled back at her, the expression feeling sharp and unfamiliar on my face. "I'd like to talk about numbers, Rebecca. Specifically, I'd like to talk about your numbers." For just a moment, her camera-ready composure slipped. But she recovered quickly, probably assuming I was having another confused episode that she could edit into engaging content later. She had no idea what was coming. The conversation I was about to have with Rebecca, the one that would destroy her carefully constructed narrative and expose her exploitation to the very audience she'd built on my suffering, would be unlike any content she'd ever posted. Because this time, the star of her show was fighting back. Over the next hour, as Rebecca's camera recorded what she thought would be another episode of Mom's Alzheimer's journey, I systematically dismantled every lie she'd told about my condition, every financial manipulation she'd hidden behind corporate structures, and every violation of trust she'd committed in the name of helping other families. I used spreadsheets, bank statements, and business documents to tell the real story of Morrison Media LLC. I explained the difference between her public claims about transparency and her private strategies for maximizing revenue from my illness. I walked through her subscriber numbers, her income streams, and the tiny consulting fee she paid me as cover for her exploitation. But most importantly, I revealed that the confused, helpless woman her audience had been watching for months was actually a certified public accountant with 40 years of experience who'd been investigating her daughter's business practices with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to uncovering corporate fraud. Rebecca tried to stop me several times, reaching for the camera, attempting to redirect the conversation, suggesting that I was having an episode and didn't understand what I was saying. But I kept talking, kept explaining, kept using her own platform to expose the truth about what she'd done. When I finished, an hour and 17 minutes later, Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. The camera was still recording, capturing her realization that she'd just filmed her own downfall. "You can't post this," she whispered. I looked at her, this stranger who wore my daughter's face, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "Actually, Rebecca, I can. You see, I read your contract very carefully before I signed it. The one that gives you permission to film me and use the footage however you see fit. The contract that makes no restrictions on what I'm allowed to say or reveal during our sessions." She'd written her own permission slip for me to destroy her. "But there's something else," I continued, my voice steady and clear in a way that her edited videos never showed. "All those bank statements and business documents I just shared with your audience? Those are going to be very interesting to the IRS when I report the discrepancies I found in your business filings. And they'll be fascinating to the state attorney general when I file a complaint about elder financial abuse." Rebecca's face went white. "Mom, you don't understand what you're doing. This is my livelihood. This is how I support my family." "No, Rebecca, this is how you exploit your family. There's a difference." I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and looked directly into the camera that had been documenting my supposed decline for months. "Hello, everyone. My name is Faye Morrison, and I'm a certified public accountant with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. For the past several months, you've been watching a version of my story that was carefully edited to make me appear more impaired than I actually am. You've been consuming content that was created without my full understanding of how it would be used, and your engagement has generated significant income for my daughter's business. I want you to understand that families dealing with dementia need support, understanding, and practical help. What we don't need is to be turned into entertainment for strangers or profit centers for people who claim to love us. The real story of living with Alzheimer's isn't just about confusion and decline. It's about fighting for your dignity when people assume you don't understand what's happening to you. It's about insisting on being seen as a complete person, not just a collection of symptoms. And sometimes, it's about using whatever cognitive abilities you still have to stand up for yourself when the people who should be protecting you are exploiting you instead. I walked over to the camera and looked directly into the lens. Rebecca will have to decide whether to post this video or not. But either way, the investigation I've conducted into her business practices will continue. The evidence I've gathered will be shared with the appropriate authorities, and the real story of what happened here will come to light. I reached out and turned off the camera. In the silence that followed, Rebecca and I stared at each other across the wreckage of the relationship I'd thought we had. She was no longer my daughter, seeking to document our journey together. She was a business owner, whose primary source of revenue had just publicly exposed her exploitation and threatened her entire operation. "You've destroyed everything," she said quietly. "No, Rebecca, you destroyed everything. I just made it visible." She gathered up her equipment with shaking hands, not meeting my eyes. At the door, she turned back one last time. "You're sicker than you think, Mom. This paranoia, these accusations, it's part of the disease. I was trying to help you." I looked at her, this person who could still try to gaslight me even after I'd systematically proven her deception with documentation she couldn't refute. "I'm an accountant, Rebecca. I deal in facts, not paranoia. And the facts show that you built a business on my illness, lied to your audience about my capabilities, and violated my trust in ways that may constitute criminal fraud." She left without another word, and I locked the door behind her. That evening, I called David and told him everything that had happened. He listened in silence, occasionally asking questions about specific details, his software engineer's mind processing the complexity of what Rebecca had done and what I'd just exposed. "Are you really going to report her to the authorities?" he asked. "I haven't decided yet, but I want her to believe I will. I want her to spend the next few weeks wondering if every knock on her door might be an investigator, every piece of mail might be a subpoena. Mom, are you sure you're okay? This whole thing, it must be overwhelming." I considered his question carefully. Was I okay? I was a 73-year-old woman with early-stage Alzheimer's who'd just discovered that my daughter had been exploiting my illness for profit and who'd spent the afternoon systematically destroying her business on camera. Actually, David, I feel better than I have in months. For the first time since my diagnosis, I feel like myself again. Because that's what Rebecca had stolen from me, more than my privacy or my dignity. She'd stolen my sense of competence, my belief that I was still capable of understanding and controlling my own life. Every video she'd posted had reinforced the message that I was becoming less than I used to be, that my value was now tied to being a cautionary tale for other families. But today, I'd used every skill I'd developed over 4 decades in accounting to uncover the truth, organize evidence, and present a case that was unassailable. I'd been strategic, methodical, and utterly clear-headed throughout the entire investigation and confrontation. I was still Faye Morrison, and Faye Morrison didn't take betrayal lying down. The question now was what Rebecca would do with the footage she'd just recorded. Would she post it, knowing it would destroy her credibility and possibly her entire business? Would she try to bury it and hope I didn't follow through on my threats? Would she attempt to spin it as another example of my declining mental state? I didn't know, but I was prepared for any response. Because while Rebecca had been learning how to manipulate algorithms and maximize engagement, I'd been learning everything I could about her business, her finances, and her vulnerabilities. The game wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. And this time, I was playing with a full understanding of the rules. Rebecca didn't post the video. For 3 days, I checked her channel obsessively, waiting to see if she'd have the courage to upload footage of her own destruction. Instead, she posted an old video from her archives, something about sustainable parenting practices that had nothing to do with me or my condition. Her regular posting schedule continued as if our confrontation had never happened, but I could feel the shift in the air around our family. David called every day, checking on me with a protective intensity that hadn't been there before. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson stopped by with more frequency, though she was careful not to mention Rebecca's videos directly. Even the mailman, who'd been delivering to my address for 15 years, seemed to linger a bit longer when he handed me my letters, his eyes searching my face for signs of the confused woman he'd seen online. The silence from Rebecca herself was absolute. No visits, no phone calls, no text messages asking how I was doing. It was as if she'd decided that cutting me off entirely was preferable to dealing with the consequences of what she'd built her business on. Part of me had expected her to try some form of damage control, perhaps an attempt to convince me that I'd misunderstood her motivations, or that my accusations were symptoms of my declining cognition. Instead, she chose strategic absence, and that told me everything I needed to know about how seriously she was taking my threats. On the 4th day, I received a certified letter from an attorney I'd never heard of. The letterhead was impressive. Thick paper with embossed gold lettering declaring the law firm of Hartwell, Brennan & Associates. The letter itself was brief and carefully worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Rebecca was claiming that I was mentally incompetent to make decisions about my own medical privacy and financial affairs. She was requesting that a court appoint her as my guardian, giving her legal authority over my healthcare, finances, and living arrangements. According to the letter, my recent behavior demonstrated clear signs of paranoia and delusional thinking that posed a danger to my well-being and that of my family. I read the letter 3 times, my hands steady even as rage built in my chest. This was Rebecca's nuclear option, her attempt to legally silence me by having me declared incompetent. If she succeeded, she could control every aspect of my life, including whether I was allowed to speak publicly about what she'd done. She could institutionalize me, take control of my finances, and continue her exploitation with the backing of the legal system. But Rebecca had made a crucial miscalculation. She was treating this like a public relations crisis that could be managed through legal maneuvering and character assassination. She'd forgotten that I wasn't just some confused elderly woman making unfounded accusations. I was an accountant with 40 years of experience dealing with financial fraud, and I had documentation that could destroy her in any court proceeding. More importantly, she'd underestimated how much I'd learned about the legal aspects of elder abuse during my investigation of her business practices. I called my own attorney, Margaret Chen, who'd handled my estate planning and business legal needs for over a decade. Margaret had known me since before her law degree, when she was a bookkeeping client struggling to organize her small business finances. She'd watched me navigate complex financial situations with precision and clarity for years. "Faye, I got a call from someone at Hartwell Brennan yesterday," Margaret said when I reached her. "They're claiming you're incompetent and requesting medical evaluations for a guardianship proceeding. I told them to send everything through me, but I wanted to hear your side of this." I explained the situation methodically, walking Margaret through Rebecca's business structure, the revenue she'd generated from exploiting my diagnosis, and the investigation I'd conducted that led to our recorded confrontation. I offered to provide her with copies of every document I'd gathered, every piece of evidence that demonstrated both Rebecca's exploitation and my own continued cognitive competence. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking questions that showed she was processing the legal implications of what I was describing. "This is elder financial abuse," she said when I finished. "And the fact that she's now trying to have you declared incompetent as a way to silence your complaints makes it even worse. It's a form of legal gaslighting." Legal gaslighting. The phrase captured exactly what Rebecca was attempting. She was using the legal system to reinforce the narrative she'd created in her videos, portraying me as too confused to understand my own situation while positioning herself as the long-suffering daughter trying to protect a mother who could no longer make rational decisions. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "First, we need comprehensive cognitive evaluations from independent medical professionals. Not just your regular doctor, but neuropsychologists who can document your current level of functioning in detail. Second, we need to organize all your evidence about Rebecca's business activities. And third, we need to be prepared to go on the offensive." Going on the offensive meant filing counterclaims against Rebecca for elder abuse, fraud, and violation of privacy rights. It meant turning her guardianship petition into a public examination of her conduct that would expose her exploitation to legal scrutiny. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "If this goes to court, it's going to become public record. Rebecca's videos, your evidence about her finances, all of it could end up being reported in local media. Are you prepared for that level of exposure?" I thought about the question carefully. For months, Rebecca had been sharing intimate details of my life with thousands of strangers for her profit. She'd made my private struggles into public entertainment without my full understanding of what that meant. Now she was trying to use the legal system to strip away my autonomy and silence my objections to her exploitation. "Margaret, I've been exposed against my will for months. At least this time, it would be on my terms." We scheduled the medical evaluations for the following week. Margaret recommended 3 different specialists who could assess my cognitive function, memory, decision-making capacity, and overall mental competence. The evaluations would be comprehensive, designed to demonstrate not just that I understood my diagnosis and its implications, but that I remained capable of making informed decisions about my own life. In the meantime, I had work to do. If Rebecca wanted to turn this into a legal battle, I was going to make sure I had every piece of ammunition I needed to destroy her case and expose her actions to the scrutiny they deserved. I spent the weekend organizing my evidence, creating the kind of comprehensive documentation package I would have prepared for any major fraud investigation. Financial records showing Rebecca's revenue streams and business structure. Screenshots of her social media posts and subscriber-only content that revealed her true motivations. Records of the consulting payments she'd made to me as legal cover for her exploitation. Correspondence that demonstrated the systematic nature of her privacy violations. But I also gathered evidence of my continued competence. Bank statements showing that I'd been managing my own finances without error. Tax documents I'd prepared myself, with the same precision I'd maintained for decades. Communications with doctors, neighbors, and service providers that demonstrated clear thinking and appropriate decision-making. Most importantly, I documented my investigation of Rebecca's business practices, showing the methodical, professional approach I'd taken to uncovering her exploitation. The spreadsheets, research notes, and analytical summaries proved that my cognitive abilities remained sharp enough to conduct complex financial analysis and present findings in a clear, organized manner. On Monday morning, I drove to the first of my medical appointments. Dr. Amanda Foster was a neuropsychologist who specialized in cognitive assessments for legal proceedings. Her office was in a medical complex downtown, and the waiting room was filled with families dealing with various forms of cognitive impairment and legal disputes. The evaluation took 4 hours. Dr. Foster put me through a battery of tests designed to assess memory, attention, problem-solving, language skills, and executive function. She asked me to recall lists of words, solve mathematical problems, interpret abstract concepts, and explain complex scenarios. She tested my ability to understand financial documents, make hypothetical medical decisions, and articulate my reasoning for various choices. Throughout the assessment, Dr. Foster maintained professional neutrality, but I could see her taking detailed notes about my responses. When we finished, she explained that she would prepare a comprehensive report about my cognitive status and functional abilities. "I can't discuss my findings until the report is complete," she said, "but I will say that your performance on these assessments has been quite strong for someone with your diagnosis." The second evaluation, with a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Robert Kim, focused more on my emotional state and mental health. He asked detailed questions about my relationship with Rebecca, my feelings about her videos, and my decision to investigate her business practices. He wanted to understand whether my accusations against Rebecca stemmed from paranoia or delusion, or whether they represented rational responses to actual exploitation. I walked Dr. Kim through my investigation methodically, explaining how I'd discovered each piece of evidence and why it led me to conclude that Rebecca was exploiting my condition for financial gain. I showed him the business documents, the social media analytics, and the communications that revealed her true motivations. "You've conducted a very thorough analysis," he said when I finished presenting my findings. "Your methodology is sound, your documentation is comprehensive, and your conclusions appear to be well supported by evidence." The third evaluation was with Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist who'd originally diagnosed my Alzheimer's. She knew my baseline cognitive function better than anyone, and could speak to how my condition had progressed since my initial diagnosis. "Faye, I've been concerned about you since Rebecca's first video was posted," Dr. Williams said during our appointment. "The woman I saw in those videos didn't match the patient I've been treating. You've maintained much higher functionality than her content suggested." I explained what I'd discovered about Rebecca's editing practices, how she'd selectively shown my worst moments while eliminating evidence of my continued competence. Dr. Williams listened with growing concern, occasionally asking questions about specific incidents that had been featured in the videos. "This is exactly the kind of situation I worry about with families dealing with dementia," she said. "The vulnerability to exploitation increases, but the assumption is often that the exploitation comes from strangers or caregivers, not from adult children who turn the situation into a business opportunity." Dr. Williams agreed to provide detailed documentation of my current cognitive status and her professional opinion about my capacity to make decisions about my own care and finances. She also offered to testify on my behalf if the guardianship case went to court. While I waited for the medical reports to be completed, I continued gathering evidence about Rebecca's activities. I discovered that she'd applied for trademark protection on several phrases related to dementia caregiving, apparently planning to expand her brand into commercial products. She'd also been in discussions with a literary agent about writing a book based on our journey together. The scope of her plans was breathtaking. She wasn't just exploiting my current situation for short-term revenue. She was building a long-term business empire based on my illness, with plans that extended far beyond social media content into publishing, speaking engagements, and product licensing. Every discovery reinforced my determination to stop her. This wasn't just about protecting my own privacy and dignity anymore. It was about preventing Rebecca from turning her exploitation of me into a template for exploiting other vulnerable families dealing with dementia. A week after my final medical evaluation, Margaret called with news. "I've received preliminary reports from all 3 specialists," she said. "Faye, these evaluations are remarkably strong. Dr. Foster found that your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for someone your age, with only minor impairments related to your Alzheimer's diagnosis. Dr. Kim concluded that your concerns about Rebecca's conduct are rational and well-founded, showing no evidence of paranoia or delusion. And Dr. Williams documented that your decision-making capacity remains fully intact. The medical evidence would demolish Rebecca's claim that I was mentally incompetent." But Margaret had more news. Rebecca's attorneys have filed additional motions. They're claiming that your investigation of her business constitutes stalking and harassment. They're also requesting emergency temporary guardianship, arguing that your, quote, increasingly erratic behavior poses an immediate threat to your safety. Emergency temporary guardianship could be granted without a full hearing, based solely on Rebecca's claims about my mental state. If successful, it would give her immediate control over my living situation, my finances, and my ability to communicate with the outside world. She could move me into a care facility and cut off my contact with Margaret, David, or anyone else who might support my version of events. How long do we have? I asked. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Friday. That gives us 3 days to prepare our response. 3 days to prevent Rebecca from legally silencing me before I could expose what she'd done. 3 days to ensure that her attempt to exploit me wouldn't succeed in court the way it had succeeded on social media. But I had advantages that Rebecca didn't expect. I had documentation that proved both her exploitation and my competence. I had medical evaluations that would demolish her claims about my mental state. And I had 40 years of experience presenting complex financial information in ways that judges and juries could understand. Most importantly, I had righteous anger, the kind of cold, focused fury that comes from being betrayed by someone you trusted, then watching them try to use the legal system to cover up their betrayal. Rebecca wanted a fight. She was about to get one. That evening, I called David and told him about the emergency hearing. His reaction was immediate and fierce. "I'm flying out tomorrow," he said. "Mom, you shouldn't have to face this alone." "You don't need to do that, David. Margaret and I have everything under control." "No, Mom. This has gone far enough. Rebecca is trying to steal your life, and I'm not going to sit in Portland while she does it." David's support meant more to me than I could express. For months, I'd felt isolated and confused about what was happening to me, wondering if I was overreacting to Rebecca's videos or misunderstanding her motivations. Having my son validate my concerns and offer to stand with me against his sister was profoundly healing. But there was something else I needed from David, something that would complete the case I was building against Rebecca. "There's a way you can help me that doesn't require you to fly out here," I told him. "I need you to contact some of Rebecca's early followers, the ones who've been commenting on her videos since the beginning. I want to document how her content has changed since she started featuring my story." David understood immediately. "You want to show that she deliberately shifted her content strategy to exploit your diagnosis." "Exactly. If I can prove that she transformed her channel specifically to monetize my illness, it strengthens the case that this was always about financial gain, not about helping other families." David agreed to reach out to Rebecca's followers under the guise of researching family dementia resources. He would gather screenshots of early comments, track changes in her content themes, and document the timeline of her business growth in relation to my diagnosis. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret and I organized our evidence, prepared our legal arguments, and coordinated with the medical professionals who would testify on my behalf. I wrote a detailed statement about Rebecca's exploitation, explaining not just what she'd done but how it had affected my sense of autonomy and dignity. On Thursday evening, David arrived from Portland. He looked tired but determined, carrying a laptop bag full of research he'd conducted about Rebecca's online activities. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first told Rebecca about my diagnosis, and reviewed the evidence we'd assembled. "Mom, I found something you need to see," David said, opening his laptop. "Rebecca has been planning this guardianship move for weeks. She posted about it in a private Facebook group for content creators." He showed me screenshots of posts Rebecca had made in a group called Monetizing Personal Content. In the posts, she discussed strategies for dealing with family members who objected to being featured in social media content. She'd asked for advice about managing difficult relatives, and had received suggestions from other creators about using legal mechanisms to silence objections. One post, dated just days after our confrontation, was particularly damning. "My mom is trying to interfere with my business by making false accusations about how I've portrayed her medical condition. Has anyone dealt with family members who don't understand the value of the content you're creating? I'm thinking about guardianship as a way to protect both her and my brand. Rebecca had been planning to have me declared incompetent as a business strategy, not out of genuine concern for my well-being. She'd sought advice from other content creators about how to silence family members who objected to being exploited, and she'd framed guardianship as a way to protect her brand rather than protect me. "This is evidence of premeditation," Margaret said when David showed her the screenshots. "She's been planning this as a way to silence your objections to her exploitation, not because she genuinely believes you're incompetent." With this final piece of evidence, our case was complete. We had medical evaluations proving my competence, financial documents proving Rebecca's exploitation, and now communications proving her intent to use guardianship as a tool to silence my legitimate complaints about her conduct. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October weather that made Cedar Rapids feel smaller and more isolated than usual. I dressed carefully for court, choosing a navy blue suit that projected competence and authority. Margaret met me at the courthouse steps, her arms full of carefully organized file folders containing every piece of evidence we'd gathered. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in Judge Catherine Morrison's courtroom. The coincidence of the judge's last name wasn't lost on me, though Margaret assured me that Judge Morrison was known for her careful attention to evidence and her skepticism of procedural manipulation. Rebecca arrived with her attorney, a man in his 50s who looked expensive and slightly bored. She was dressed conservatively, playing the role of the concerned daughter trying to protect her declining mother. She didn't meet my eyes as we entered the courtroom, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she clutched her purse like a shield. The proceeding began with Rebecca's attorney presenting their case for emergency guardianship. He painted a picture of a woman whose cognitive decline had accelerated dramatically, who was making paranoid accusations against the daughter who cared for her, and who posed a danger to herself through increasingly erratic behavior. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison's recent conduct demonstrates clear evidence of delusional thinking and poor judgment. She has accused her daughter of financial exploitation based on conspiracy theories about business records she doesn't understand. She has made threats about legal action that have no basis in reality. Most concerning, she has begun exhibiting paranoid behavior that suggests her Alzheimer's disease is progressing more rapidly than initially diagnosed." It was a skillful presentation, designed to make me sound like exactly the kind of confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own poor judgment. Rebecca's attorney had taken my legitimate complaints about exploitation and reframed them as symptoms of cognitive decline. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed that I wouldn't be able to respond coherently to his allegations, that my presence in court would support his narrative about my incompetence. When Margaret rose to present our response, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She began by introducing the medical evaluations that documented my continued cognitive competence. But she didn't stop there. She methodically presented evidence of Rebecca's business activities, her revenue from exploiting my diagnosis, and her deliberate misrepresentation of my condition to her audience. "Your Honor, this is not a case of a daughter seeking to protect her mother from the effects of cognitive decline. This is a case of a daughter attempting to use the legal system to silence a mother who discovered and exposed her daughter's financial exploitation." Margaret presented Rebecca's business documents, her social media analytics, and the communications from the content creator group that revealed her true motivations for seeking guardianship. She called Dr. Foster to testify about my cognitive evaluations, Dr. Kim to address my mental health status, and Dr. Williams to explain how Rebecca's videos had misrepresented my actual condition. The testimony was devastating to Rebecca's case. 3 medical professionals, testifying under oath, confirmed that I remained mentally competent to make my own decisions, and that my accusations against Rebecca were rational responses to actual exploitation, not symptoms of paranoia or delusion. But the moment that changed everything was when Margaret asked me to testify on my own behalf. I took the witness stand with the same confidence I'd brought to countless client presentations over the years. I explained my professional background, my approach to investigating Rebecca's business activities, and my findings about her exploitation of my diagnosis. I walked the judge through spreadsheets showing Rebecca's revenue growth, business documents revealing her corporate structure, and social media posts demonstrating her deliberate misrepresentation of my condition. "Your Honor, I am a woman with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, But I am not a woman who has lost the ability to understand when she's being exploited. I discovered that my daughter was generating significant income by portraying me as more impaired than I actually am, and when I confronted her about this exploitation, she attempted to have me declared incompetent as a way to silence my objections. I looked directly at Rebecca as I continued. This guardianship petition is not about protecting me. It's about protecting her business model, which depends on my continued cooperation with content that violates my dignity and privacy. Judge Morrison asked me several questions about my investigation, my understanding of Rebecca's business activities, and my reasons for objecting to her videos. I answered each question clearly and thoroughly, demonstrating exactly the kind of cognitive function that Rebecca's attorney had claimed I no longer possessed. When the testimony concluded, Judge Morrison took a brief recess to review the evidence. During the break, I sat with Margaret and David, feeling strangely calm despite the magnitude of what was at stake. Either Rebecca would succeed in having me declared incompetent, giving her legal authority to control every aspect of my life, or her attempt to silence me would backfire spectacularly. Judge Morrison returned with a decision that was swift and decisive. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. The evidence presented today demonstrates clearly that Mrs. Morrison retains full decision-making capacity, and that her concerns about her daughter's conduct are well-founded rather than delusional. Furthermore, this court is troubled by evidence suggesting that the guardianship petition may have been filed not out of genuine concern for Mrs. Morrison's welfare, but as an attempt to silence legitimate complaints about financial exploitation. The judge continued. This court is referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office for investigation of potential elder abuse and to the state attorney general's office for investigation of potential consumer fraud related to the misrepresentation of Mrs. Morrison's condition in commercial content. Rebecca's fate in trying to silence me through the legal system, she'd instead triggered official investigations into her conduct that could result in criminal charges. Additionally, Judge Morrison said, Mrs. Morrison is granted a temporary restraining order prohibiting her daughter from filming, recording, or posting any content featuring Mrs. Morrison without her written consent. Violation of this order will result in contempt of court charges. The gavel came down with finality. Rebecca's attempt to legally silence me had failed completely, and now she faced the prospect of criminal investigation for the very conduct she'd tried to hide through guardianship. As we left the courthouse, David walked beside me with visible relief. Margaret was already planning our next steps, discussing the timeline for the official investigations and the possibility of civil action against Rebecca for damages. But I was thinking about something simpler. For the first time in months, I was free to tell my own story without fear that Rebecca could use the legal system to silence me. I was free to live my life, manage my illness, and make my own decisions about my privacy and dignity. Rebecca's attempt to steal my autonomy had backfired completely. Instead of gaining control over my life, she'd lost all credibility and faced the possibility of criminal prosecution. The woman who'd built a business on my vulnerability had discovered that vulnerability can sometimes fight back with devastating effectiveness. And I was just getting started. The prosecutorial investigation began within a week of Judge Morrison's order. Detective Sarah Huang from the Cedar Rapids Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice professional but warm as she explained what would happen next. The investigation would examine Rebecca's business practices for potential elder abuse, fraud, and violations of consumer protection laws related to her misrepresentation of my condition in commercial content. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand that this is going to be a thorough process, Detective Huang explained during our first meeting at the police station. We'll be looking at financial records, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the content your daughter posted to determine if criminal charges are appropriate. I provided Detective Huang with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered during my own investigation. The business documents showing Rebecca's revenue streams, the social media analytics demonstrating her content strategy, the communications from content creator groups revealing her motivations for seeking guardianship. She reviewed everything with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. Elder financial abuse has become increasingly sophisticated, she told me. We're seeing more cases where family members create business structures to legitimize what is essentially exploitation of vulnerable relatives. Your daughter's approach was particularly calculated because she used your own consent as legal cover, for activities that went far beyond what you actually agreed to. The State Attorney General's office launched a parallel investigation into consumer fraud. Rebecca's misrepresentation of my condition to her audience, combined with her monetization of that misrepresentation, potentially violated state laws about false advertising and consumer deception. If people were paying for content based on Rebecca's claims about my illness, and those claims were deliberately exaggerated, she could face serious criminal charges. While the investigations proceeded, I focused on rebuilding my life free from Rebecca's surveillance and exploitation. The restraining order meant that she couldn't film me or post any content featuring me without my written permission, which I had no intention of providing. For the first time in months, I could have bad days without worrying that they would become content for thousands of strangers to dissect. David extended his stay in Cedar Rapids, working remotely while helping me navigate the aftermath of the court proceedings. His presence was a reminder of what healthy family support looked like, the kind of care that didn't involve cameras or audiences or revenue streams. He helped me organize my financial documents, accompanied me to medical appointments, and spent evenings with me discussing everything except my illness. "I keep thinking about what she stole from you," David said one evening as we sat in my living room. "It wasn't just your privacy. She stole your right to be sick on your own terms." His observation cut to the heart of what Rebecca's exploitation had cost me. She'd taken away my agency over my own illness, turning my private struggle into public performance. Every moment of confusion, every episode of forgetting, every instance of vulnerability had become potential content for her business. I'd lost the right to have bad days without an audience, to struggle without judgment, to maintain dignity in the face of a devastating diagnosis. The psychological impact of that loss was only becoming clear now that the surveillance had ended. I found myself unconsciously performing competence in ways I hadn't realized I'd been doing, overcompensating for the image Rebecca had created of me as helpless and confused. I'd internalized her narrative about my decline to such an extent that I'd begun doubting my own perceptions of my capabilities. Dr. Williams referred me to a therapist who specialized in trauma related to family exploitation. Dr. Linda Reeves was a woman in her 60s who'd worked extensively with elderly clients dealing with abuse by adult children. During our first session, she helped me understand that what Rebecca had done constituted a form of psychological abuse that went beyond financial exploitation. When someone systematically misrepresents your condition to others, especially when that misrepresentation serves their financial interests, it creates a form of gaslighting, Dr. Reeves explained. You begin to question your own perceptions because the public narrative about your capabilities doesn't match your private experience of yourself. The therapy sessions helped me process the anger I'd been carrying about Rebecca's betrayal. For months, I'd focused my energy on gathering evidence and building a legal case against her, channeling my rage into productive action. But now that the legal machinery was in motion, I needed to deal with the emotional devastation of discovering that my daughter had been willing to exploit my illness for personal gain. The community response to my situation was overwhelmingly supportive. Word had spread through Cedar Rapids about the court proceedings, and people who'd watched Rebecca's videos began reaching out to express their concern about what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Patterson organized a group of neighbors to provide practical support, helping with grocery shopping, yard work, and household maintenance. They offered assistance without treating me like an invalid, respecting my autonomy while acknowledging that I might occasionally need help. Local business owners who'd worked with me over the years made a point of stopping by to check on me. The manager of the bank where I'd done business for decades assured me that my accounts would be monitored for any suspicious activity. The pharmacist at my longtime drugstore offered to coordinate my medication deliveries to ensure I never missed doses due to memory issues. This was what genuine support for someone with dementia looked like. Practical help offered with dignity, assistance provided without exploitation, care given without cameras. The contrast with Rebecca's approach was stark and painful. 3 weeks after the court hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. Janet Morrison, the librarian who'd helped me research Rebecca's business activities, appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon with a concerned expression and a manila envelope in her hands. "Faye, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but something came across my desk that I thought you should see immediately." Inside the envelope was a printout of a blog post from a content creation website. The post was titled, "When Family Members Sabotage Your Brand, a Case Study in Crisis Management." It was written by someone using the pseudonym Authentic Mom Blogger. But Janet had traced the IP address and determined that it had been posted from Rebecca's home computer. The blog post was a detailed account of my confrontation with Rebecca, framed as a cautionary tale for other content creators about dealing with difficult family members who didn't understand the value of personal storytelling. Rebecca had twisted our entire conflict into a narrative about entitled relatives who tried to interfere with legitimate business activities. In the post, she described me as an elderly woman whose cognitive decline had made her paranoid and suspicious of her daughter's efforts to help other families. She portrayed my investigation of her business practices as evidence of my deteriorating mental state, and my successful court challenge as the result of manipulative attorneys who'd taken advantage of my confusion. Most disturbing was her advice to other content creators about how to protect themselves from similar situations. She recommended creating detailed legal documentation to establish family members' consent to being featured in content, building relationships with medical professionals who could testify about relatives' cognitive decline, and developing strategies for discrediting accusations of exploitation. "She's turned what happened to you into a business strategy for other people who want to exploit their families," Janet said, her voice filled with disgust. "She's teaching other content creators how to do what she did to you, but more carefully." The blog post revealed that Rebecca hadn't learned anything from her legal defeat. Instead of recognizing the ethical problems with her exploitation of my illness, she doubled down on her belief that she was the victim of my unreasonable objections to her content creation. She was now positioning herself as an expert on managing difficult family dynamics in the content creation industry. I called Margaret immediately to discuss the legal implications of Rebecca's blog post. While she'd been careful not to name me directly, the details were specific enough that anyone following our court case would recognize the situation she was describing. Her characterization of my cognitive state and her claims about my motivations could constitute defamation, and her advice to other content creators about exploiting family members might violate the terms of the restraining order. This gives us additional evidence of her mindset and her intent to continue exploiting vulnerable family members, Margaret explained. "It also shows that she's completely unrepentant about what she did to you." The blog post was shared in several content creator forums, where Rebecca received support from other creators who saw her as a victim of family interference rather than as an exploiter of vulnerable relatives. The response revealed how common this type of exploitation had become in the social media industry, with creators routinely featuring family members' private struggles for public consumption without fully considering the ethical implications. Detective Huang was particularly interested in the blog post when I shared it with her. "This shows ongoing pattern of exploitation and a willingness to share strategies for exploiting vulnerable family members with other potential perpetrators," she said. "It strengthens the case that her actions were deliberately predatory rather than misguided attempts to help." As autumn deepened into winter, the investigation continued to reveal the full scope of Rebecca's business activities. Financial records showed that she'd been planning to expand her brand into multiple revenue streams, including a planned book deal, speaking engagements about dementia caregiving, and a product line of items designed for families dealing with cognitive decline. All of these ventures were built on the foundation of her portrayal of my condition, using my illness as the basis for her expertise in dementia care. She'd been positioning herself as a thought leader in the field, despite having no medical training or professional experience with dementia beyond exploiting her own mother's diagnosis. The book proposal, which investigators obtained through a subpoena of her literary agent's records, was particularly revealing. Titled Our Beautiful Journey, A Daughter's Guide to Loving Through Alzheimer's, it promised to share intimate details of our family's experience with dementia, while offering practical advice for other families facing similar challenges. The proposal included sample chapters that featured private conversations I'd had with Rebecca about my fears and concerns regarding my diagnosis. Conversations I'd assumed were confidential family discussions had been recorded and transcribed for potential publication. My most vulnerable moments, my private struggles with accepting my diagnosis, my intimate fears about losing myself to the disease, were all packaged as content for a commercial book project. Rebecca had been secretly recording our conversations for months, gathering material for a book that would have generated substantial revenue, while further violating my privacy and dignity. The discovery of these recordings added wiretapping charges to the growing list of potential criminal violations. The speaking engagement contracts revealed that Rebecca had been booking appearances at medical conferences and caregiver support groups, presenting herself as an expert on dementia care based on her experience with me. She was charging substantial fees to share insights about supporting family members with cognitive decline, insights that were based entirely on her exploitation of my condition. Her planned product line included items like medication organizers, memory aids, and adaptive clothing designed for dementia patients. Each product was to be marketed with testimonials about how it had helped Mom manage her daily activities, using my image and my struggles as advertising content for commercial products. The scope of her plans was breathtaking in its cynicism. She'd envisioned building an entire business empire on the foundation of my illness, monetizing every aspect of my condition for her personal profit. My diagnosis hadn't been a family crisis to her. It had been a business opportunity that she'd methodically exploited across multiple revenue streams. During this period, I rarely heard from Rebecca directly. She'd made no attempt to apologize for her actions or to rebuild our relationship. Instead, she seemed to be focusing her energy on legal defense strategies and damage control for her business activities. Her social media presence shifted away from dementia content toward more general parenting topics, apparently in response to legal advice about avoiding further evidence of exploitation. The few communications I received from her came through attorneys, formal legal documents that addressed procedural matters related to the ongoing investigations. There were no personal messages, no expressions of regret, no acknowledgement that she'd damaged our relationship through her actions. She was treating our family conflict as a business dispute, rather than a betrayal of trust between mother and daughter. David struggled with Rebecca's silence more than I did. As her brother, he'd hoped that losing the court case might prompt some self-reflection and eventual accountability. Instead, her response seemed to be doubling down on her belief that she'd done nothing wrong while developing strategies to avoid consequences for her actions. "I keep waiting for her to call and apologize," David told me during one of our evening conversations. "I keep thinking that somewhere inside her is the sister I grew up with, someone who would be horrified to realize what she'd done to you." But the Rebecca who'd grown up in our house, who'd learned values of honesty and integrity at our kitchen table, seemed to have been replaced by someone who saw family relationships primarily as opportunities for content creation and revenue generation. The sister David remembered might still exist somewhere, but she'd been eclipsed by the entrepreneur who'd discovered that personal trauma could be profitably monetized. The preliminary hearing for the criminal charges was scheduled for early December. By that time, investigators had assembled a comprehensive case that included financial records, medical evaluations, witness testimony, and evidence of Rebecca's attempts to silence my complaints through legal manipulation. The charges being considered included elder financial abuse, consumer fraud, invasion of privacy, and illegal recording of private conversations. If convicted on all charges, Rebecca could face several years in prison and substantial financial penalties. Her business would likely be shut down, and she'd be required to pay restitution for the revenue she'd generated through exploiting my condition. Margaret explained that I would need to testify about the impact of Rebecca's actions on my life and well-being. The prosecution wanted me to describe not just the financial exploitation, but the emotional damage caused by having my private struggles turned into public entertainment. "They need the jury to understand that this wasn't a victimless crime," Margaret said. "Rebecca's exploitation caused real harm to a vulnerable person, and the court needs to hear about that harm directly from you." Preparing for my testimony meant revisiting the most painful aspects of what Rebecca had done to me. Working with Dr. Reeves, I practiced articulating how the exploitation had affected my sense of autonomy, my relationship with my own illness, and my ability to trust family members with my vulnerability. The hardest part was acknowledging how Rebecca's betrayal had changed my experience of having Alzheimer's. Instead of being able to focus on managing my condition and maintaining my quality of life, I had spent months feeling surveilled and performed, always aware that my struggles might become content for strangers to consume. She'd stolen my right to be sick privately, to have bad days without an audience, to struggle with my diagnosis without having that struggle monetized for her benefit. The violation went beyond financial exploitation to something more fundamental: the theft of my dignity and autonomy during one of the most vulnerable periods of my life. As the hearing date approached, I found myself thinking not about revenge or punishment, but about prevention. Rebecca's actions weren't unique. They represented a broader pattern of exploitation enabled by social media platforms that rewarded personal trauma sharing with revenue and attention. Other families were likely experiencing similar violations, with vulnerable members being turned into content without their full understanding of what that meant. The legal proceedings against Rebecca could serve as a precedent, establishing that consent to share personal struggles didn't constitute blanket permission for exploitation. The case could help protect other vulnerable individuals from family members who saw their conditions as business opportunities rather than personal challenges requiring support and dignity. But regardless of the legal outcomes, I'd already achieved something important for myself. I'd refused to be silenced when confronted with exploitation. I'd used my professional skills and cognitive abilities to uncover the truth about what was being done to me. I'd stood up in court and demonstrated that having Alzheimer's didn't make me powerless to advocate for my own rights and dignity. Rebecca had underestimated the woman she was exploiting, assuming that my diagnosis made me vulnerable to manipulation and unable to understand what she was doing to me. She'd learned, too late, that cognitive decline doesn't necessarily mean cognitive incompetence, and that someone with early-stage Alzheimer's could still be a formidable opponent when defending their rights. The preliminary hearing would determine whether the case proceeded to trial, but I'd already won the victory that mattered most to me. I'd reclaimed my agency over my own illness and my own story. I'd proven that vulnerability doesn't have to mean victimhood, and that even someone with dementia could fight back effectively against exploitation. Rebecca had tried to turn my illness into her success story. Instead, she'd given me the opportunity to demonstrate that strength and dignity could coexist with cognitive decline, and that fighting for yourself was sometimes the most powerful medicine available. The woman who'd built a business on my supposed helplessness was about to discover just how wrong she'd been about my capabilities. And the legal system was about to send a message that exploiting vulnerable family members came with serious consequences, regardless of how cleverly that exploitation was packaged as caregiving or awareness raising. As December approached and the hearing date drew near, I felt a calm determination settling over me. This wasn't about destroying Rebecca or seeking revenge for her betrayal. This was about standing up for every vulnerable person who'd been turned into content by family members who prioritized profit over protection. The fight was almost over, but the victory was already mine. The courthouse was packed with reporters when I arrived for Rebecca's trial on a cold morning in February. Word had spread about the case through social media circles and local news outlets, turning what had started as a family dispute into a broader conversation about exploitation in the digital age. I walked through the crowd of cameras and microphones with Margaret at my side, declining to comment but feeling steady and prepared for what lay ahead. The trial itself took 3 days. The prosecution presented a methodical case that laid out Rebecca's financial exploitation in devastating detail. They showed the jury her business records, her revenue projections, her secret recordings of our private conversations, and her plans to build an empire on my illness. Expert witnesses testified about elder abuse, the psychological impact of exploitation, and the specific vulnerabilities created by cognitive decline. When I took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. I spoke directly to the jury about what it meant to have your most vulnerable moments turned into entertainment for strangers. I explained how Rebecca had violated not just my privacy but my right to maintain dignity while facing a devastating diagnosis. I described the gaslighting that occurred when someone systematically misrepresents your condition to others, making you question your own perceptions of your capabilities. My daughter didn't document our journey through Alzheimer's, I told the jury. She manufactured a narrative about my decline that served her business interests while erasing my continued competence and autonomy. She turned my illness into a performance, and when I objected to that performance, she tried to have me legally silenced. The defense attorney attempted to portray Rebecca as a well-meaning daughter who'd made mistakes while trying to help other families. He argued that her videos had provided valuable education about dementia and that any exploitation was unintentional. but the evidence was overwhelming. The secret recordings, the revenue projections, the communications about managing difficult family members, all painted a picture of calculated exploitation rather than misguided caregiving. Rebecca herself took the stand on the final day. She maintained that her videos had been educational and helpful, that the revenue was secondary to the awareness she was raising about dementia. She claimed that my objections were symptoms of my cognitive decline rather than rational responses to her exploitation. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor methodically dismantled her narrative. He showed her the communications where she'd complained about my good days interfering with her content calendar. He read aloud her blog post teaching other creators how to exploit family members more effectively. He presented her book proposal, which included intimate details of conversations I'd never consented to share publicly. By the time she left the stand, Rebecca's claim of innocent intentions had been thoroughly discredited. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: elder financial abuse, consumer fraud, invasion of privacy, and illegal recording of private conversations. Judge Morrison sentenced Rebecca to 18 months in prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and restitution totaling $97,000, representing all revenue she generated from content featuring me. The judge also ordered her to remove all videos featuring me from her social media platforms and prohibited her from posting any content about me or my condition in the future. The defendant systematically exploited her mother's vulnerability for personal profit, Judge Morrison said during sentencing. She violated trust, invaded privacy, and caused significant emotional harm to a person she claimed to be protecting. This sentence reflects the seriousness of elder abuse and sends a clear message that family relationships cannot be used as cover for financial exploitation. The conviction made national news, with legal experts calling it a landmark case in the prosecution of social media exploitation. Advocacy groups for elderly rights praised the verdict as an important precedent for protecting vulnerable individuals from family members who might seek to monetize their conditions or circumstances. But for me, the most meaningful moment came after the sentencing, when David and I walked out of the courthouse together. For the first time in over a year, I felt completely free from surveillance, exploitation, and the fear that my worst moments might become content for strangers to consume. I could focus entirely on managing my health and maintaining my quality of life, without worrying about how my struggles might be used by someone who claimed to love me. Rebecca served her full sentence. During her incarceration, she participated in counseling programs designed to help her understand the impact of her actions. The therapist's reports, which became part of her probation file, indicated that she'd begun to recognize the harm she'd caused, though full acceptance of responsibility remained a work in progress. Upon her release, Rebecca sent me a letter through Margaret. It was brief and carefully worded, probably reviewed by attorneys and therapists, but it contained what appeared to be genuine remorse for her actions. She acknowledged that she'd violated my trust and privacy, that she'd prioritized her business interests over my well-being, and that her attempts to silence me through legal manipulation had been wrong. "I understand if you can never forgive me," she wrote. "I violated something sacred between us, and I turned your illness into my opportunity. I'm working to understand how I became someone who could do that to her own mother, and I hope someday to become someone worthy of asking for your forgiveness." I read the letter several times before filing it away. Forgiveness would be a process, if it came at all. Rebecca had stolen something from me that couldn't be fully restored through apologies or legal victories. She'd taken away my right to be vulnerable without exploitation, to struggle privately with my diagnosis, to maintain dignity during one of the most challenging periods of my life. But I'd also discovered something valuable through the ordeal. I'd learned that having Alzheimer's didn't make me powerless to defend myself. I'd proven that cognitive decline didn't necessarily mean loss of agency or competence. I'd demonstrated that even someone with dementia could successfully advocate for their rights and hold exploitative family members accountable for their actions. The case inspired changes in platform policies about medical content. Several social media companies implemented new guidelines requiring additional consent and verification when content featured individuals with cognitive impairments or other vulnerabilities. Content creators were required to provide documentation of informed consent and medical clearance before monetizing videos featuring family members with dementia or similar conditions. Legal experts use the case as precedent in other elder abuse prosecutions, particularly those involving family members who exploited vulnerable relatives through social media. The conviction established that consent to being filmed didn't constitute blanket permission for exploitation, and that misrepresenting someone's condition for commercial purposes could constitute fraud regardless of family relationships. Advocacy organizations invited me to speak about my experience at conferences and support groups. I accepted some of these invitations, sharing my story not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman who'd successfully fought back against exploitation. I wanted other families to understand that vulnerability didn't have to mean victimhood, and that people with cognitive impairments retained rights that deserved protection and respect. During one particularly meaningful speaking engagement at a dementia support group, an elderly man approached me afterward with tears in his eyes. His daughter had been posting videos about his condition without his full understanding of their reach or impact, and my story had given him the courage to assert his rights over his own privacy and dignity. "I thought I didn't have any choice," he told me. "I thought because I have this disease, I had to accept whatever my family decided to do. You showed me that I still have power over my own life." These conversations reinforced my belief that the legal victory had been about more than holding Rebecca accountable. It had been about establishing that people with cognitive impairments retained fundamental rights to privacy, dignity, and self-determination. The case had created precedent that could protect other vulnerable individuals from family members who might see their conditions as content opportunities rather than personal challenges requiring support. David and I developed a closer relationship through the ordeal. He moved back to Cedar Rapids permanently, taking a remote position that allowed him to be nearby without being intrusive. We established new family traditions that respected my autonomy while acknowledging that I might occasionally need support managing my condition. Our relationship became a model for what healthy family support for someone with dementia could look like. David provided practical assistance when needed, emotional support when requested, and advocacy when appropriate, but he never treated me as incapable or tried to make decisions for me without my input. He respected my right to manage my own illness while offering help that enhanced my independence rather than undermining it. My condition progressed slowly, as Dr. Williams had predicted. Some days were more challenging than others, but I developed strategies for managing symptoms while maintaining my sense of self and autonomy. I continued living independently, driving when appropriate, managing my finances, and making my own decisions about medical care and daily activities. The experience with Rebecca had taught me that maintaining dignity with dementia required active advocacy rather than passive acceptance. I'd learned to communicate clearly about my needs and boundaries, to seek help when appropriate while resisting unnecessary intervention, and to insist on being treated as a complete person rather than just a collection of symptoms. Mrs. Patterson and her husband became close friends during this period. Mr. Patterson's condition had progressed more rapidly than mine, but Mrs. Patterson had learned to provide support while preserving his dignity and autonomy. Watching their relationship reinforced my understanding that caregiving could be done with love and respect rather than control and exploitation. I also maintained my accounting practice on a limited basis, helping a few longtime clients with their annual tax preparation and financial planning. The work kept my mind sharp and provided a sense of purpose and competence that was important for my overall well-being. My clients trusted my expertise despite my diagnosis, understanding that early-stage Alzheimer's didn't necessarily impair my professional abilities. 2 years after Rebecca's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call from a documentary filmmaker named Maria Santos. She was working on a film about exploitation in social media and wanted to include my story as an example of successful resistance to family abuse. Initially, I was hesitant to participate in any media project given my experience with Rebecca's exploitation. But after meeting with Maria and her team, I decided to share my story on my own terms. The documentary would focus on my investigation and legal victory rather than my illness, portraying me as an empowered advocate rather than a vulnerable victim. I retained editorial control over how my story was presented and how my current condition was portrayed. The documentary, titled Invisible No More: Fighting Back Against Family Exploitation, premiered at several film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming platform. The film helped raise awareness about elder abuse in the digital age and inspired other families to seek help when dealing with exploitative relatives. Most importantly, the documentary allowed me to control my own narrative for the first time since my diagnosis. Instead of being portrayed as Rebecca's confused, helpless mother, I was presented as a competent woman who'd used her professional skills to uncover exploitation and her personal strength to fight back against abuse. The film showed that people with dementia could be powerful advocates for themselves and others facing similar challenges. Rebecca completed her probation period without incident. According to court records, she found employment as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit organization focused on family services. She was prohibited from working in social media or content creation as a condition of her probation, but the reports suggested she was complying with all requirements and continuing her counseling work. I occasionally wondered if she'd truly understood the impact of her actions, or if she was simply following legal requirements to avoid further consequences. The letter she'd sent after her release had seemed sincere, but words were easier than changed behavior. True accountability would require more than apologies. It would require fundamental changes in how she viewed relationships and responsibilities toward vulnerable family members. Whether Rebecca achieved that level of personal growth remained to be seen. What mattered to me was that the legal system had held her accountable for her actions and established precedent that could protect other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation. The case had sent a clear message that family relationships couldn't be used as cover for abuse, regardless of how that abuse was packaged or justified. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that Rebecca's exploitation had ultimately led to something positive, though not in the way she'd intended. Her attempts to turn my illness into content had forced me to discover reserves of strength and determination I might never have accessed otherwise. Fighting back against her abuse had given me a sense of purpose and empowerment that helped me manage my condition more effectively. The ordeal had also connected me with a community of advocates and survivors who were working to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation. Through speaking engagements and support group participation, I'd met other people who'd successfully fought back against abuse and who were using their experiences to help others facing similar challenges. Most importantly, I'd learned that having Alzheimer's didn't mean losing everything that made me who I was. My professional skills, my analytical abilities, my sense of justice, and my determination to protect myself and others remained intact despite my diagnosis. The disease had taken some things from me, but it hadn't taken my essential self or my ability to fight for what was right. On quiet evenings in my home, surrounded by books I could still read and financial documents I could still analyze, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about what I'd accomplished. I'd refused to be erased by someone who claimed to love me but had treated me as a commodity. I'd proven that vulnerability didn't have to mean victimhood, and that people with cognitive impairments retained the right to dignity, privacy, and self-determination. Rebecca had tried to steal my story, but I'd taken it back. She'd attempted to define me through my worst moments, but I'd shown that I was much more than my diagnosis. She'd built a business on my supposed helplessness, but I demonstrated exactly how wrong she'd been about my capabilities. The woman who'd thought she could exploit her mother's illness for profit had learned that some people fight back, even when the odds seem stacked against them. And sometimes, the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the ones with the most strength to offer. My story wasn't about Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't about decline or loss or the tragedy of cognitive impairment. It was about refusing to be silenced, insisting on dignity, and proving that strength could coexist with vulnerability in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. I was still Faye Morrison, certified public accountant, homeowner, mother, and advocate. And despite everything Rebecca had tried to take from me, I was still standing. 3 years after Rebecca's conviction, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness and family. Detective Huang's voice was careful as she explained that Rebecca had violated the terms of her restraining order by attempting to contact me through a third party. The violation had occurred when Rebecca reached out to Janet Morrison, the librarian who'd helped me during my investigation. Rebecca had asked Janet to deliver a message requesting a meeting with me, claiming she had important information about other content creators who were exploiting vulnerable family members. Janet had immediately reported the contact to authorities, knowing that any communication between Rebecca and me had to go through official legal channels. The message she wanted Janet to deliver was about a support group she'd joined for people who've committed elder abuse, Detective Huang explained. Apparently she's learned about several other cases similar to yours and thinks you might want to know about them. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca was now violating court orders in an attempt to help other exploitation victims, perhaps genuinely trying to make amends for her actions by exposing similar abuse. But good intentions didn't excuse legal violations, and her approach demonstrated that she still struggled to respect boundaries and authority. Margaret advised against any direct contact with Rebecca, even through official channels. The restraining order existed to protect me from manipulation and harassment, and Rebecca's pattern of using intermediaries to circumvent legal restrictions suggested she hadn't fully internalized the need to respect my autonomy and privacy. She's testing the boundaries, Margaret explained. Even if her motivations are positive now, she's still trying to insert herself into your life without your permission. That's the same controlling behavior that led to the original exploitation. Instead of responding to Rebecca's overture, I decided to pursue the information about other exploitation cases through proper channels. Detective Huang connected me with investigators in other jurisdictions who were working on similar cases involving family members who exploited vulnerable relatives through social media. The scope of the problem was larger than I'd imagined. Across the country, elderly individuals with various conditions were being featured in their adult children's content without fully understanding the commercial implications. Parents with Parkinson's disease became subjects of awareness videos that generated substantial revenue. Grandparents with limited mobility were featured in caregiving journey content that built personal brands for their relatives. The pattern was always similar. Adult children positioned themselves as devoted caregivers while systematically documenting their relatives' struggles for public consumption. They claimed to be educating audiences and reducing stigma, but the financial incentives revealed different motivations. Revenue from ads, sponsorships, and premium content subscriptions created powerful incentives to sensationalize and extend family members' difficulties. My case had become a template for prosecutors pursuing similar charges. The legal precedent established by Rebecca's conviction was being used to hold other exploitive family members accountable for their actions. Several cases were moving through courts across the country, with prosecutors citing my successful prosecution as evidence that family relationships couldn't shield abusers from criminal consequences. One case in particular caught my attention. A woman in Phoenix had been featuring her father's dementia progression in daily vlogs that generated over 6 figures annually. Like Rebecca, she'd created business structures to legitimize her exploitation and had attempted to have her father declared incompetent when he objected to being filmed. Unlike Rebecca, she'd been stopped before her legal manipulation succeeded, thanks partly to prosecutors who'd learned from my experience. The Phoenix case investigator, Detective Maria Rodriguez, invited me to testify as an expert witness about the psychological impact of family exploitation. My testimony would help the jury understand how this type of abuse affected victims beyond just financial harm. Testifying in another family's case felt like completing a circle. I was using my experience with Rebecca's exploitation to help protect another vulnerable person from similar abuse. The knowledge I'd gained through fighting back against my daughter was now serving a broader purpose in protecting other families from exploitation. During my testimony in Phoenix, I explained how family exploitation differed from other forms of elder abuse because it involved betrayal of intimate trust relationships. When strangers exploit elderly individuals, the victims can maintain their sense of family support as a source of strength. When family members become the exploiters, victims lose their most fundamental source of security and protection. The defendant's father trusted her to care for him with dignity during his illness, I told the Phoenix jury. Instead, she turned his most vulnerable moments into entertainment for strangers. That betrayal goes beyond financial exploitation to something much deeper and more damaging to the victim's sense of safety and self-worth. The Phoenix jury convicted the defendant on all charges, and the judge sentenced her to 2 years in prison plus restitution. The case established additional precedent about the psychological harm caused by family exploitation and strengthened protections for vulnerable individuals across multiple jurisdictions. As these cases proceeded, I found myself becoming an unofficial advocate for exploitation victims and their families. Support groups for elder abuse survivors began inviting me to speak about resistance strategies and legal options. Medical professionals asked me to train healthcare workers about recognizing signs of social media exploitation in their patients. The work was meaningful but emotionally challenging. Each case I learned about reminded me of my own experience with Rebecca's betrayal, forcing me to relive aspects of that trauma while helping others navigate similar situations. Dr. Reeves helped me develop strategies for managing the emotional impact of advocacy work, while maintaining my own psychological well-being. "You're transforming your personal trauma into social action," Dr. Reeves observed during one of our sessions. "That's profoundly healing, but it requires careful emotional boundaries to avoid re-traumatization." The boundaries became especially important when I began receiving letters from other exploitation victims across the country. Some had seen news coverage of my case or the documentary about my experience. Others had been referred to me by attorneys or advocacy organizations. All were seeking advice about fighting back against exploitative family members. Reading these letters was heartbreaking. The patterns were so similar to my own experience. Adult children, who positioned themselves as devoted caregivers, while systematically violating their parents' privacy and dignity for commercial gain. Elderly individuals who felt confused and powerless to stop exploitation that was disguised as love and support. One letter that particularly affected me came from Eleanor Washington, an 80-year-old woman in Atlanta whose son had been featuring her diabetes management in daily health and wellness videos. Like Rebecca, he'd claimed to be educating audiences about senior health while generating substantial revenue from her medical struggles. "I tried to tell him I didn't want strangers knowing about my blood sugar levels and medication problems," Eleanor wrote. "He said I was being selfish, that we were helping other families deal with diabetes. But I see the comments people make about me, calling me stubborn or difficult, when I struggle with my routine. They don't know me, but they judge me based on my worst moments." Eleanor's situation was complicated by the fact that she did occasionally need help managing her diabetes, making it harder to distinguish between legitimate caregiving and exploitative documentation. Her son had skillfully blurred the lines between support and surveillance, making her feel ungrateful for objecting to content that was ostensibly designed to help her. I worked with Eleanor's attorney to develop strategies for addressing her situation, drawing on lessons learned from my own case. We documented the commercial aspects of her son's content, gathered evidence of his revenue streams, and prepared medical evaluations demonstrating her continued decision-making capacity regarding her own healthcare privacy. Eleanor's case resulted in a settlement that prohibited her son from featuring her in future content without written consent, and required him to remove existing videos that violated her privacy. The settlement also included financial compensation for revenue generated from her medical information without adequate consent. These individual victories felt meaningful, but they also highlighted the scope of the problem. For every case that resulted in successful prosecution or settlement, there were likely dozens of others where exploitation continued unchecked. Many victims lacked the resources, support systems, or cognitive capacity to fight back effectively against exploitative family members. The systemic nature of the problem required broader solutions than individual legal actions could provide. I began working with advocacy organizations to push for legislative changes that would better protect vulnerable individuals from family exploitation through social media. One promising development was the introduction of state laws requiring enhanced consent procedures when commercial content featured individuals with cognitive impairments or other vulnerabilities. These laws would require medical clearance and independent legal representation before vulnerable individuals could be featured in monetized content, even by family members. Another important initiative involved training programs for healthcare workers, social workers, and other professionals who worked with vulnerable populations. These programs taught recognition of exploitation warning signs and provided resources for helping victims pursue legal remedies when appropriate. The social media platforms themselves began implementing more robust protections after facing public pressure and potential legal liability. New policies required additional verification and consent documentation when content featured vulnerable individuals, and platforms developed mechanisms for family members to report potential exploitation of relatives. These systemic changes felt like the most important legacy of my fight against Rebecca's exploitation. Individual legal victories helped specific victims, but policy changes could protect countless others from similar abuse in the future. During this period, I also focused on my own continued well-being and independence. My Alzheimer's symptoms progressed slowly, as Dr. Williams had predicted, but I maintained my ability to live independently and manage my own affairs. The advocacy work provided a sense of purpose that seemed to have positive effects on my cognitive function and overall health. David remained a steady source of support without being intrusive or controlling. He'd learned from watching Rebecca's exploitation that genuine care involved respecting autonomy rather than assuming authority. Our relationship became a model for how families could support members with cognitive impairments, while preserving dignity and self-determination. I also maintained connections with friends and neighbors who treated me as a complete person, rather than just someone with a medical condition. Mrs. Patterson and I continued our friendship, supporting each other through the challenges of managing our husbands and our own health issues. These relationships reinforced my sense of identity beyond my diagnosis and my role as an exploitation survivor. 4 years after Rebecca's conviction, I received word that she'd completed her probation successfully and was seeking to have her criminal record expunged. The legal request required notification of victims, giving me an opportunity to support or oppose the expungement petition. Margaret explained that expungement would remove Rebecca's conviction from most public records, though law enforcement and certain employers would still have access to the information. Rebecca's attorney argued that she'd completed all requirements of her sentence, participated in counseling programs, and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. "The decision is entirely yours," Margaret told me. "You can oppose the expungement, support it, or remain neutral. There's no right or wrong choice, just what feels appropriate to you given everything that's happened." I spent weeks considering the decision. Part of me felt that Rebecca's exploitation had been so calculating and harmful that the conviction should remain visible as a warning to potential future victims. But another part recognized that people could change, and that permanent consequences might prevent genuine rehabilitation and growth. Ultimately, I decided not to oppose the expungement. Rebecca had served her sentence, paid restitution, and apparently complied with all legal requirements. More importantly, the precedent established by her conviction would remain in legal databases, regardless of whether her individual record was expunged. The systemic impact of the case didn't depend on her permanent criminal status. The expungement was granted 6 months later. I felt a sense of closure about that chapter of our relationship, though I maintained the restraining order that prohibited direct contact between us. Forgiveness didn't require removing all protective boundaries, and healing didn't necessitate renewed family relationships. As I approached my 77th birthday, I reflected on how my life had changed since Rebecca's exploitation began 5 years earlier. The experience had been devastating in many ways, violating my trust and privacy while forcing me to confront the reality that someone I loved had been willing to profit from my illness. But the experience had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. I'd successfully advocated for myself against significant odds, used my professional skills to uncover complex exploitation, and transformed personal trauma into meaningful advocacy work that helped protect other vulnerable individuals. Most importantly, I'd proven that having Alzheimer's disease didn't make me powerless or incompetent. My diagnosis was just one aspect of who I was, not a definition of my entire identity or capabilities. I remained a skilled accountant, a devoted mother to David, a loyal friend, and an effective advocate for others facing similar challenges. The advocacy work continued to provide purpose and meaning as my condition progressed. I adapted my activities to accommodate changing abilities while maintaining involvement in causes that mattered to me. Some days were more challenging than others, but I'd learned to accept fluctuations in cognitive function while preserving my essential sense of self. Rebecca and I would probably never have a relationship again, and I'd made peace with that reality. Some betrayals cut too deep for full healing, and some violations of trust couldn't be undone through apologies or changed behavior. But I'd found ways to transform that loss into something positive through advocacy work that protected other families from similar exploitation. The woman who'd tried to steal my story had inadvertently given me a more powerful narrative than she'd ever created with her manipulative videos. My real story wasn't about decline or helplessness or the tragedy of cognitive impairment. It was about resistance, strength, and the refusal to be silenced by someone who underestimated my capabilities. I was still Faye Morrison, and I was still fighting for what was right. That was a legacy worth defending, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.